Hello, welcome to week 13, invasive species, alien species, and all things fish. This lecture is being brought to you mask-free because I'm a rebel. Anyway, hi guys. So we're talking this week, if I get my computer to work, about alien species. And of course, you know me, my first thought was to find some cheesy picture of a little green man. But alien species doesn't always mean alien to Earth. It could just mean alien to Chicago, like me, or alien to Illinois. And so a lot of plants and animals in this world are alien. A lot of our garden plants are alien. They're not from here, they're from somewhere else. If you are in North or South America, apples, oats, cabbage, these are not native to North America. They are brought here by man. So they're an alien species. Tomatoes, potatoes, chilies, chocolate, these are not native to Africa or Europe or Asia. They're native to, actually, most of them, Central America. And so you could say that, potatoes are aliens to Ireland. In fact, even animals and people, dogs and cats and horses and cows are not native to the Americas. So that's a lot of different animals, right? But not all alien species are beloved as dogs, and sometimes they can cause problems. And so when an alien species causes a negative reaction into an environment, that's often when we term it an invasive species. So what is that? Well, first of all, an invasive species is just like an alien species. It's not native to that ecosystem. Something caused it to move there, and that's usually people. So a good example is the pineapple. When we think of pineapples, we usually think of Hawaii, but they are not native to Hawaii. They were brought there by people in the 1800s because the climate in Hawaii is actually very favorable, so pineapples do quite well there. But this could be limited to things also in Hawaii alone, like sugarcane and bananas and cows. Okay, so an invasive species isn't always necessarily a bad thing. Let me rephrase that. A non native organism is not always a bad thing. But when it does cause issues, then it becomes invasive, right? And so a lot of times when we bring in non-native species, there are unintended consequences that we'll talk about in a little bit that can lead to issues for the native species. And it might end up that some of the native species go extinct. So in Hawaii, for instance, pineapples and people and rats and cows and sugarcane are all non-native organisms. But what has happened in the meantime, one of the unintentional things was the largest animal in Hawaii before people came was a goose called the nene, and it is now almost extinct. Okay? And by the way, invasive species can be plants or animals or even germs. So if these plants and animals or people and these non-native species, if they're not from that area, then how come they succeed there? Well, usually what happens is the ones that do succeed, because many don't, when they get there, when they brought the pineapple to Hawaii, one of the reasons it did well was because the habitat, the weather was very well. A lot of times when these animals or plants come to a new area, they encounter a new kind of a complex food web like we talked about. And there's nothing in there, in that environment, to slow their growth. So think back to the very first week, right? And we talked about the wolves of Yellowstone and how if you took out the wolves, the population of deer would expand because there was nothing to keep the deer in check, right? So if this animal comes to a new habitat and there's nothing to eat it, it's going to grow like crazy. So some of the problems, if these invasive species grow too fast or too many, they can basically crowd out and take away food of the native species. Sometimes they carry diseases. So um, we get a lot of our diseases actually in the human race, like the flu. Actually, most of the flu germs that we get originate with birds, and it's the people that keep in contact with birds that eat them. That's actually how it first spreads. So they can have diseases that are new, right? And they can also basically out eat or outcompete native species to the point where they might even hunt them or kill them on their own. And so they can change these ecosystems that have been around for thousands or millions of years and replace themselves quickly. Some of them do so well in changing the ecosystem that they basically crash it completely. And a good example is the Asian carp on the Illinois River. This is supposed to load any minute now. So let me start with that delay.
This is what happens when a particular population of fish in the Illinois River is startled.
Yeah, oh, right around back, behind the boat. Wow. Watch out. They're everywhere.
These are silver carp, the most notorious of the Asian carp family. Many believe the Illinois River has the densest population of silver carp in the nation.
That's kind of ground zero on this invasion.
Asian carp were introduced to the United States in the 1970s to control algae in catfish farms in the South. In the 1980s, floodwaters allowed the carp to escape and infest the Mississippi River basin.
When it comes to the river systems, if it's connected, if it's got a direct connection to the Mississippi or the Illinois River, it's going to have these fish in it.
Asian carp not only disrupt the food chain, push out native fish, are a nuisance to boaters, but they are also extremely dangerous.
Yeah, this is about an average size silver carp. This is one that can hurt you when it jumps. If your boat's going 20, 30 miles an hour and this guy hits you, it's going to leave a mark.
It was a flying silver carp that broke this woman's jaw as she participated in a sport created for the sole purpose of hunting this nuisance fish. Their population is growing at a rapid pace. The females can lay 2 million eggs a year, and they grow rapidly.
Once they get to a certain size, we don't have a predator that's capable of eating them, and they're just running unchecked.
So how do we get rid of them? Some say if you can't beat them, eat them. They believe that creating an appetite for silver carp will hold their population in check.
The vision about all this is to literally educate our people how to eat this fish.
But getting Americans to eat silver carp has been challenging.
People in this country just don't seem to want to pick around the bones. The biggest problem with these fish are that the fillets are filled with bones.
Now there is concern that Asian carp have a path out of the rivers and into the Great Lakes through the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. So a multi-million-dollar electronic barrier has been constructed to potentially stop the migration.
With the barriers in place, we are effectively plugging the biggest hole for the movement of these fish. It would be very difficult for fish to just swim right through this waterway behind us.
But not everyone is convinced. So cleaning, training, and drying boats every time they come out of the water can prevent the tiny microscopic creatures who lurk there from ending up in lakes and rivers where they shouldn't call home. It's the best defense we have against the ever-growing world of the silent invaders.
Alright, so an invasive species, the Asian carp, a little bit dramatic music, but you get the idea, right? And so they're brought here intentionally, not to Illinois. They actually brought down to Arkansas, where they were farming catfish, but they got out during a flood and spread, and it's a huge issue. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, another way they spread is trash. So bryozoans, they look like this here. They're basically this microscopic organism that builds a colony, and they basically coat or encrust things in the water. And they can actually be in like marine junk that floats in the water, and they can be spread that way. People throw their trash overboard on a boat, or it gets into the water, it can have this stuff. What's the problem? Well, it can clog up the bottom of boats, which makes them harder to steer. It can actually get onto water intake pipes and drains and make them harder to work. So that can be quite a nuisance as well. Another way they get there is ballast water. When boats cross the ocean, a lot of times they'll take in a lot of water and they put it in the bottom of the boat to make it heavy so that it sits lower in the water and it's a little bit more stable in the waves. But when they get to port and they don't need to worry about that, they'll pump it out. Now the problem is sometimes in that water, when they suck it up, there's tiny little microscopic zooplankton that we talked about, or eggs of other animals, and these hitch a ride all the way across the water, and then they're dumped out. And one of the biggest issues in Lake Michigan are what they call the zebra and quagga mussels. these tiny little clams, right? They're about maybe this big, tiny little things. But what happens is their eggs got stuck in that ballast water, and they are in all the Great Lakes, and they get here and they basically stick themselves to things like barnacles. This is the inside of a pipe, and they grow like crazy. And they've had a couple big issues. One thing is, like, remember how we said Chicago gets our drinking water from Lake Michigan? They have to go through these pipes every so often and basically scrape these off, or they will plug them up. They line and coat the bottom of docks. The other thing they do, which is truly scary, is that they filter the water. They basically take in all the little tiny little animals and they filter them out. And the water in Lake Michigan is so much clearer, which sounds like a good thing because these animals are cleaning it. But that means there's no food for the native species. And we're seeing a huge change in the ecosystem of Lake Michigan because of this. Another way that it spreads, and again, usually by people unintentionally, are pets. Remember last year? Remember Chance the Snapper? He was the alligator that was hanging out, swimming around in the Garfield Park Lagoon. Or was it Humboldt Park? I'm so sorry. It was Humboldt Park, right? Alligator. Not native to here. But someone had a little pet alligator. That's what they figured happened. You can buy these. You're not supposed to, but people do. And he got kind of big, and they didn't want him. So they thought, oh, I'm going to be nice, and I'm going to let him loose in the park. Well, what happened was he got to be quite big, and we are very lucky that he didn't hurt somebody, right? But in Florida, they have a huge issue. People who have boa constrictors or other animals will let them loose. And in Florida, the environment for the boa constrictor is perfect. It's warm, has lots of small animals, and there's hardly nothing to eat them, and they get to be quite huge. In fact, boa constrictors have become such a problem that in the Everglades in Florida, we're seeing the ecosystem begin to collapse because they're eating all the small animals and nothing stops them. So what can we do about this, right? Well, first thing is prevention. So you saw in that Asian carp video about washing your boat, they're talking about, if you go out on a boat, make sure you clean it so you don't unintentionally carry any kind of small eggs or animals with you. Prevention. If you fly to Hawaii, when you get to the airport, you have to go through and be checked if you're bringing any plants or animals. You can't just bring your animal with you or a plant. They have to make sure that it's not an invasive species. And a lot of countries have this. So the best way to stop this is to not let it happen, because usually when they get here, the next thing is containment, and that's not always easily done. So here's an example. If you go to any kind of campground in the Midwest, you'll often see these posters about firewood. Don't bring firewood from home. You have to bring firewood. You have to buy it at the campground. And that's because what if you are in Illinois and you have some firewood in the back of your house, and then you go to northern Wisconsin? Well, there is this little bug called the emerald ash borer. It actually digs into trees and eats under their barks. This is from China. It's an invasive species. And when it got here, the problem with it is there is nothing to stop it. There's nothing. It loves to eat the trees, and there's no animals that can stop it. And so a lot of the trees in the Midwest are infested with this. And if you bring firewood, there's a good chance, if you bring it to a state that doesn't have this bug, you're bringing the bug with you. And so they actually have that law to kind of contain the damage. Doesn't always work. Containment. Remember the Asian carp? This is actually what's going on right now. This right here is the Illinois River. And so over here is Lake Michigan. And this is an artificial man-made connection, the Chicago Sanitary Canal, that connects it. There's nothing to stop those fish from swimming all the way up here and into Lake Michigan. And the worry is, if the Asian carp get into Lake Michigan, that in about 10 to 15 years, they will be the only fish in Lake Michigan. So that's a huge issue. Right now, we actually have these electric barriers. These are basically underwater electric fences that stop them. So it looks kind of like this from the surface. You can kind of see it right here. How effective is it? Well, they've never caught an Asian carp past this in the lake, but when they do other types of studies, they have found evidence of carp DNA. So we're not quite sure if that means that maybe one got past or maybe another animal ate it. We're not quite sure, but we still have yet to see it. And a lot of people are calling for this canal to actually be filled in as a last-ditch barrier. Really, other than that, that's the problem with invasive species. There really isn't a lot you can do. Once they're here and they start to succeed, it's like trying to pull up dandelions on your lawn, right? You can pull one up, but there'll be another one sprouting. So we're going to pause right here. That'll be part one. When we come back, we're going to talk about fish.